A man and a woman were trapped on a freezing cliff, with temperatures dropping below -99.99 degrees. Beneath them was a deadly abyss. There was no path forward, and going back was impossible. With no other option, the man took a risk. He threw his backpack down and leapt toward a tree. The woman screamed in panic. Moments later, she heard his voice below, "Jump to the tree. You'll be safe." She hesitated, but with no other way out, she took a deep breath and jumped. Whether she made it safely, and why they ended up stranded, goes back to a few days earlier. Jane lived in a care home for people with suicidal thoughts. One day, she stole a bunch of pills, planning to take her life during her flight back home. At the airport, a friendly stranger named Paul tried to talk to her. She politely responded but wasn't interested. Coincidentally, they ended up sitting next to each other on the plane. Paul chatted excitedly, but Jane was only thinking about how to end her life. As the plane took off and stabilized, she wrote a note saying her death wasn't Paul's fault and slipped it into his pocket. Then she calmly walked to the bathroom, poured out the pills, and filled a cup of water. But before she could take them, the plane hit turbulence, the pills scattered. A flight attendant told her to return to her seat. Then the plane shook violently. Lights flickered, people screamed. An explosion erupted outside the window. Jane hit her head and passed out. When she came to, everything was quiet. She opened the door and was shocked. Pieces of the plane were everywhere, and bodies lay scattered. One woman nearby was gasping her last breath. Jane searched for survivors and finally heard someone, Paul. He had broken ribs and was in terrible pain. Together, they found part of the cabin for shelter, but it was too cold. They squeezed into a small bathroom for warmth. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They had a few supplies, some food and water. The next morning, Jane kicked open the door. The storm had passed. All around them was snow. Paul joked that Jane was supposed to bury him, but now it was the other way around. He didn't want to wait to be rescued, he wanted to escape on foot. Jane still wanted to die and refused. After arguing, Paul left. But Jane, not wanting to die alone, followed him. They walked together across the snow with no clear direction. Eventually, they reached a steep cliff. It was dangerous, but the only way forward. Slowly, they climbed down, hugging the icy rocks. Then, the path ended. Going back wasn't an option. Paul looked at a tree nearby, tossed his bag, and jumped. Jane was terrified.
Paul! Are you okay?
But Paul shouted that she'd be safe if she landed on the tree. And then, she jumped. Branches breaking her fall. Paul was hurt worse, his ribs more damaged, and his phone broken. Jane's phone had been destroyed in the crash. Paul noticed Jane's pills and realized she wanted to end her life. She didn't want to talk about it. With no time to waste, they kept moving. They crossed mountain after mountain. Jane grew tired, but Paul urged her to keep going before another storm hit. Eventually, they found a cave. Paul called to her, but Jane didn't hear. Suddenly, an avalanche swept down. Jane was buried in snow. Paul dug frantically and managed to pull her out, dragging her into the cave. Hours later, she woke up. Paul finally admitted he had swapped seats just to sit next to her. He had been drawn to her since seeing her at security. Jane opened up too. As a child, she had found her father dead on Christmas morning. She always believed she could have stopped it. The trauma haunted her, filling her with guilt and suicidal thoughts. Now, they had survived a crash and an avalanche. Stuck in the cave with worsening weather, Paul's injuries grew worse. He wanted to take sleeping pills and end it. But this time, Jane encouraged him to live. She told him there was still hope. They held each other tightly. The next day, the skies cleared. They left the cave, crossed more mountains, and finally spotted a river. Paul was so excited that he slipped and fell badly, breaking his arm. Jane helped patch him up.
What? God!
That night, they camped under the stars. Jane kept Paul awake by talking, afraid he might die if he fell asleep. The next day, Paul suddenly vomited blood. His condition was critical. He told Jane to leave him and go find help. Jane was heartbroken, but promised to return. Alone, she trekked through the wilderness until a wild wolf chased her. She scrambled up a tree, used a branch to drive it off, but it came back. She ran, tripped, and the wolf lunged. She wrapped her coat around her arm, bracing for the bite, and stabbed it with a shard of broken glass she had meant to use on herself. The wolf died. Injured, crying, she kept moving. She finally reached a river, crossed it, and kept going until she collapsed on a roadside. 2 days later, she woke up in a hospital. Her mother was beside her. Jane immediately asked about Paul, but her mother gave her terrible news. Paul didn't make it. He had left her a letter, asking her to live happily.